Hey friends, and welcome back to the Rewind podcast of Forward Church. Join us each week as we take a look back on Sunday's message and dig a little deeper into the conversations with those who are teaching across our sites at Forward. We want to invite you to be part of the conversation too. So if something we're talking about on Sunday morning sparks a question in you, head to our website, forwardchurch.ca/ask us, and submit your questions there. And we're going to do our best to engage with those questions in this space. With that said, let's jump in and get started.
Hello and welcome. You are listening to the Forward Rewind podcast, and you won't regret it. It's going to be a great way to start your day, maybe end your day. But I am sitting here with Pastor Derek and Pastor Daryl with bated breath because...
It's actually just bad breath.
Oh, well, it's not me. Maybe it's you.
Thanks for keeping us on track there.
Yeah.
Thank you for
and
that.
we're already off track again. We've had an interesting start. But bated breath, I'll explain that to you, Derek, later, what that means. Because we were talking before the podcast.
Smells like fish bait.
And I immediately stopped you guys and was like, wait, this is our opener. Stop talking. And then Billy hit the record. So let's get back to our conversation, which was a question that Andrew gave to me, a good ice-breaking question, because he linked, he brought up Paul from Acts, that we are in our Sense series, and we were hanging out in Acts 17, and we got to see Paul when he quotes the poets. And Andrew said... near the end, right? That was kind of near the end.
Yeah.
And Andrew said you should ask them what their favorite secular songs are so that we can address the poetry of the day. I don't even know if these were his words.
Yeah, I think that's kind of it.
I'm not fluent in Andrew, but I think that's the gist of what I got. Anyway,
sounds about right.
So we started talking about it, and then I was like, wait, hold on. So where we were at was, first of all, I actually learned something new about Derek that I did not know, and it's that you actually do love rap.
I like some rap.
And I did not know that. We already know about your eclectic choices.
I enjoy some rap.
Do you?
Yeah,
Okay, but here's what I don't understand. You can like rap, but you hate country music. And I mean, like, don't get me wrong. If I had to pick between rap and country music, I'd probably pick country music, to be honest. But... where we left off was you were saying that you didn't have a song. It changes
Actually,
with your mood.
I think the exact spot we left off was I said, country music sucks, but I understand why there's a draw towards people listening to it, which is that I think a lot of popular music currently doesn't really, and this was Daryl's point. Daryl was talking about how like it doesn't have really anything behind it, right?
Yeah.
It's really vapid.
Yeah. But you were saying the real question is the comedians and their poetry.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so I've heard, I don't know who originally said this, but they said that comedians are the only truth sayers of the day.
Right.
I don't know who originally said that, but basically they're like, no one else is out there telling you the truth. Like music and like movies, leave it to the comedians, because what are they doing? They're pushing the edge, right? Like they're trying to find the thing that, to be quite frank, will be edgy and get them views online.
Comedians and Hallmark Christmas movies, I'll tell you the truth. Those are the two things I think the truth tellers of our world.
That yes, 100%. But I think
that's
like
sarcasm.
the same thing about poetry that Paul is getting to, and I think it used to be more. Musicians used to be more of the truth sayers of the day. Yeah. And this is what I brought up. I just feel like a lot of music nowadays, not to be the grumpy old man in the room, but I feel like a lot of music nowadays doesn't say a whole lot. And when it tries to say something, there's some backlash. So like last week, Taylor Swift put out an album with some music videos. And one music video was her standing on a scale, and when she stood on it, then it said, overweight or fat or something like that.
Okay.
And she has like this alter ego in the music video who like, anyways, it's all about like this like feeling bad about yourself and like wrestling through that. And people got upset about it because they're like, all right, but you're like a very skinny person on camera. Like this doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And she got all this backlash of like trying to make some type of point, but then like this immediate backlash.
Okay.
And it's like, oh, okay, better stick to not saying these types of things. But I think what Derek's saying is maybe country music pushes that a little bit more.
I think you've got a point there, because that says, I think, something about where we are in our culture anyhow, which is we actually don't want to talk about anything of significance or meat or value. And we end up talking about vapid things. We kind of center our life around stuff that in the end doesn't have a lot of meaning to it.
Right.
But what I was going to say, like in order to build up all of you to say, I understand my brothers and sisters who for some reason like country music. I don't enjoy the twang or the sound of it.
No.
But I will say this, when I listen to country music, a lot of it is telling stories.
Right.
I think there's stories that probably relate to a certain demographic and segment. I think there's a reason why, like, oftentimes country music in small town or rural places, because it tells the stories that resonate with a lot of people there, right? Interestingly, when rap really became mainstream, it had to leave some of the truth telling of the stories of the places in which it originated behind in order to really become popular.
Right.
But if you look
localized,
if you look at the kind of roots of rap music, it was poetry, and it was the story of people who were living in a certain reality, right? That wasn't going to connect with white kids in the suburbs. Let's be honest, right? So I think oftentimes in order to sell music in our culture, you have to actually remove meaning out of it and just catch people with a catchy little tune.
To get the largest group under your song hit.
When we're having a little bit of discussion around, we won't get into that.
Okay.
We were talking about some church music and worship music and some of the realities that have maybe driven that over the last 20 years as well, right? At least in terms of sound. So,
but I think, like, on the side of like the pop, like super popular music and it not necessarily saying something, I did have an interesting conversation with a good friend of mine who's like just an incredible musician. He was saying, like, it's really, really hard to actually come up with one of those hooks like that will have this mass appeal.
Yeah, for sure.
He's like, for those who are gonna like, say, oh, that's just vapid. He's like, then you try. He's like, it's really, really hard. So as a really like talented musician, he was saying how he has like incredible amount of respect for people who are able to write those hooks that become these massive hits. So even though I think the message maybe isn't there, there's this interesting like side of like talent to be able to make something.
100%. And I was saying, hey, I'm probably not going to give you a favorite song because I'm not really like, I don't often listen, especially to non-Christian music, that I'm not listening to it for the lyrics at all. Like I just like a tune. I just like a sound. I told you, I really like songs oftentimes that have horns in them, right? And Amanda will tell you, like, basically, if a pop song puts some horns in it, like, it draws me to it. Because I'm listening to the different sounds and melodies, but not really paying a ton of attention to what is being written or sung.
And the reason why I don't listen to a lot of rap music, but I like listening to it sometimes and it makes me pause to, like, re-listen to it and be like, oh, what did he just say? Because this guy just like put out like an incredibly important point. But that's usually from the Christian rap hip hop artists, to be quite honest with you. So one guy, just his lyrics just hit really hard and from a entirely different perspective than myself. And just, anyways, so.
I didn't realize how inappropriate most of the music I listened to as a teenager was until I was a parent in a car with my kids, and all of a sudden I actually started to listen to what the lyrics were saying, and I was like, "Ooh, I don't want my kids to listen to this." Right?
For sure, because you're drawn to the tune of it.
I was just drawn to the tune. I was just drawn to the feel of the music.
I have the same problem with movies I grew up watching because I watched them.
It's also true
on TV.
Yes,
where they were censored, and so I'm like, oh, let's watch this movie. It's from the 80s. We'll start watching. I'm like, I don't remember that scene or like the language. Like it was all anyway. So TV definitely edited those movies. Yep. You realize these things as you get a little bit older.
And have kids too. Well, Andrew, props. That was a good icebreaker because it directly related. That was not wasted time. It was related to our sermon title, which was Starting Where People Are. And we are in, I don't even know what week we are. We only have a few weeks left, though, of our Send series.
2 weeks left, so we're week 8.
Okay, so 2 weeks left, and we are in Acts 17. Why don't we go...
It's only 11 chapters to cover in 2 weeks. Easy peasy.
Easy peasy, no problemo. I have a feeling these next 2 week podcasts are going to be loaded. But we'll take it to our typical... podcast pattern here of getting an overview of your message and the main takeaways. Let's start with Daryl today.
All right. Yeah. So my main takeaway from this passage, so we're looking in Acts chapter 17, where he is speaking in Athens, speaking to an entirely different group of people. And the big takeaway that I shared was we need to start where people are at, but we must not leave them there. Mm-hmm. And so the whole point and what Paul really just incredibly illustrates for us in this passage is identifying kind of where are people at in their beliefs and their understanding of themselves and of the world around them. And then you start to build this bridge. Okay, so if that's where they're at, and if this is where I'm over here as a follower of Christ, how can I start making some connecting points? And we just talked about that. I mean, he made a connecting point using poetry, and he also would make connecting points using scripture, all depending on where that person is at in their relationship with God and their understanding of Christianity. But at some point, we don't just build a bridge, we actually boldly proclaim who Christ is. At some point in your relationship with someone who is not a follower of Christ, we have to get to that point where we actually share with them the gospel. And I think that is a scary moment, but an absolutely necessary moment for us to get to.
And Derek, you guys, obviously fairly parallel, but I felt like your points were different, but kind of came together. Both each, I know you probably didn't get to hear each other's sermons, but they kind of did. They kind of like zippered together. It was kind of cool.
Yeah. So I just was trying to look at that question that I posed at the beginning of my message, which is how do we meet people where they are and then move people towards Jesus? Very similar to what just different wording from what Daryl's using, and then looking at this example that Paul gives us in Athens at Marseille to see how he does that. What is the process that he moves through in engaging the people in Athens with the gospel?
So we did a whole sermon on this concept, meeting people where they're at. Why so important? Why have a whole sermon on it? What's the risk if we don't consider this?
The risk is that I think we end up with good intentions of trying to point people towards Jesus, but we speak in a language that nobody understands.
So it goes right over their head.
Right. If you want to communicate with people, it's not just the intention of what you're saying, but it's what the hearer on the other end hears, right?
Right.
Both things matter if you're actually going to have a conversation with someone. Right. And I think we understand this in a missions realm. Cross-cultural missions, if you've grown up in the church, people understand, people do cultural training and they get to know the people that they're going to speak to, the unique culture they learn the language. But we have not learned those skills in a post-Christian culture, many of us, as we try and engage our neighbors and coworkers with the gospel. They don't understand the language sometimes that we're talking about, and we muddle the message of the gospel, or we don't understand where they're coming from and where the cultural touch points are in order to open up conversations. And so we either speak at them in ways that are unintelligible, or we try and reason with them from touch points that they don't find compelling because we're using and referring to authorities that they don't recognize.
On the mission side of things, I had a conversation with someone about this a long time ago. They were from the perspective of, in church, you can only sing hymns songs that are in the hymnal book. And I was talking with them about this. I'm like, well, if you're a missionary in an entirely different country where they speak an entirely different language, what types of songs do you think they're going to sing? And they're like, well, probably songs in their language, that they've written and everything like that. And I'm like, well, why is it that we have to sing these songs that, don't necessarily speak to our current generation? And I found that just kind of this interesting conversation about, we sometimes have this better perspective of when we do cross-cultural missions than necessarily reaching our next door neighbors.
I think both of those points that each of you mentioned can kind of bring us to a place of discussing like the reputation that Christians can have in the world. And last week we talked about preventing unnecessary barriers for people following Christ. And if you haven't heard last week's podcast, we'll throw a link up for you. So then do you think a negative reputation Christians have with the world could be one of these barriers?
Sure. Here's what I would say. If you only had to choose one of two things, and it was a choice between living like Jesus and loving people like Jesus loved people, and learning all the right lingo to use and the right questions to probe and answer, I'd lean into loving people all the time. But the reality is, and I said this in my message, I think loving people, if we really love people, moves us to want to try and communicate in a language that is intelligible to them, right? Mm-hmm. I mentioned that if you have a deaf child, you wouldn't just say, well, I don't know sign language, so I can't talk to my kid.
Right.
Your love for your deaf child would compel you to learn sign language so you communicate with them.
Right.
It's actually love that compels us to move forward in learning to communicate. So, if you have to choose one or the other, live like Jesus. That's the most compelling witness you can offer, is just live a spirit-filled, Jesus-filled life. But I think ultimately living that life is going to compel you to want to learn how to engage people who are far from the gospel with the gospel.
Yeah, and we got pretty practical with that this week. You gave us a couple of scenarios, Derek. You told us of an experience in Lebanon that you had where you got to put a lot of these points into practice and were able to identify and share a belief and of truth about Jesus to a group of people there. And so making this even more practical, because that's what the podcast is for, everybody, is we got some listener questions and they're practical. So if it's okay with you guys, let's go that route.
Sure.
Right away, because I love when we get listeners' questions. Confetti. So we got to honor them. And it's practical. So hopefully our listeners will find this helpful. So when you were talking about giving your example in Lebanon, Derek, but you touched a little bit on like even speaking with Muslim community and even atheists. So let's get even more practical that way, because I think even just based on Kitchener-Waterloo, Cambridge, like all of us know someone in those two categories. Sure. I think it would be safe to say that. What about speaking to the Muslim community? Can you give us some direction on where to start with those conversations?
Okay, so the first thing I'm going to say goes back to what I just said a moment ago with you, which is the very best apologetic that you can have with someone who is a Muslim is to live your faith out and follow Jesus really well.
Okay.
Because if you're following Jesus faithfully, you'll be the best Muslim around. Like you will live with an ethic that a Muslim will really respect.
Okay.
And they'll say, hey, that is a good and godly person.
So that's a connection right there.
So that's a connection. That will open up opportunities for you if you live a life of faithfully following Jesus. I promise you, like you will earn the respect of people around you who are devout Muslims. The second thing, and this is what I talked about on Sunday, is go to shared points of agreement like Paul did with the poets. And for us, with our Muslim neighbors, co-workers, it is Old Testament narratives and stories. Because they'll find those stories in the Quran as well. So I was, like another story, I mentioned Abraham. Abraham's a great story to go to because you've got the story of Abraham going to sacrifice Isaac and then staying his hand and providing the sacrifice and saying, hey, like, actually, we believe that ultimate sacrifice that was provided, that's the fulfillment of all this, is Jesus, right? Joseph is actually the longest narrative story in the Quran, much like it is in the Old Testament. So that is a wonderful story to go and look and draw out some gospel principles and parallels to. The story of Joseph ends with Joseph making this wonderful statement to his brothers, you intended it for evil, but God intended it for good. And we, as Christians, believe that that is actually fulfilled ultimately in the cross. What was intended for evil in the murder of Christ actually provided the ultimate greatest good that was our pride. So just finding those points of agreement to build gospel conversations around.
Yeah. And the second listener question was very similar, only it was a reach and a request for help in talking to atheists, a different group. And maybe the atheist has been damaged from the church or by Christians. Can we discuss further on practical ways we can approach discussion with them and meeting them where they're at?
Do you want to jump in, or you want me to jump in?
Oh, sorry. I thought the question was
whoever.
Well, here, I'll jump in, and then you
Sure.
You can jump in afterwards.
The questions are always for everyone.
Oh, sorry. I was waiting for him to jump in.
Here's what I usually find with. I want to be careful in this, okay? With people who are skeptical of Christianity, who have significant doubts, oftentimes those doubts are laid on top of a deep hurt that has taken place. It doesn't mean that the questions aren't valid, they're not appropriate. And oftentimes people don't even necessarily realize this, but there's almost always a hurting heart underneath what is couched as strictly intellectual questions. And Jesus was a master of answering questions with questions.
Yes, he was.
I think it's really helpful for us to not fall into feeling the need to always be able to answer everything all the time, and sometimes to ask a question back to try and find out where is this coming out of? Because you won't ultimately fix heart issues with answering questions of the mind.
Right.
I'm a big believer in apologetics. I'm a big believer in reasonable, rational faith, and that we should be able to make a reasonable defense of the faith. But I think sometimes we're best served to take a stab at answering the question, but also to ask questions back and to try and find out what's going on under the surface. Because the great thing about the gospel, the great thing about Jesus is he didn't just come to answer our questions, he came to heal our hearts. And how you answer the problem of a heart is often different than how you answer the intellectual question that somebody has. So, if somebody is struggling with questions, if their question is around the problem of evil, but deep down what they really struggle with is a life that has been wounded by injustice. I can intellectually answer the problem of evil in a way that's never going to satisfy the hurt of that soul, right?
Yeah.
But you know who came to satisfy the hurt of the soul is Jesus, who came to die on the cross to suffer the injustice that was done, and ultimately to create a new heaven and a new earth where injustice is no more.
Yeah.
Right? I can point them towards a God who actually understands what it is to suffer injustice himself. So, I think spirit leading, right? And then just also just listening to people. I don't know if you have anything you want to add in, Daryl.
Yeah, and I think getting to the heart is so important, and not just the head, because I think that's often where we approach apologetics, like just thinking about I think often the way that we think about engaging someone who's of a different religion or who's an atheist, we want to jump to the points of disagreement right away. It's, this is what I believe about Jesus. This is what I believe that, God is real. And immediately starting there, whereas often it's where you jump to the areas of agreement, of areas where actually that's how you can actually begin to engage their heart a little bit more. And though I'm right there with Derek about how, love apologetics, think it's vastly, vastly important for us to truly know our faith and how to communicate it. But rarely, if ever, is someone argued into the kingdom. Usually you have to make that heart connection with them first. And at some point, that intellectual understanding does need to come into play. I don't want to downplay that entirely, but arguing someone into the kingdom, I don't know if I've yet to see that truly work its way out.
That's a really good way to put it, like arguing someone into the kingdom, because I think you're right in as someone who does find something like this very intimidating. Intellect is what is intimidating. The intellect part is what can be intimidating. But when you encourage us to connect with the heart, well, I have a heart too. They have one too. There's a connect right there. Like you can, and then it goes back to your first point, your number one point of like acknowledging and loving the lost person and wanting to see them know the gospel, right? To connect that way, for me, feels a little less intimidating than like charging at them with an intellect. Yeah. And maybe our listeners feel differently. Maybe like the heart is way more intimidating than the intellect. Maybe you can throw us some feedback, email me. If it's relatable, we'll bring it up on the podcast again. But these are great listener questions. Well done, listeners. There is one more that I'd love for you guys to touch on. Sometimes you both had a point of kind of like the bold charge for the finish, like the further engagement, so to speak, near the end, right? And Derek, you kind of straight up told us to like there's work to be done. Like it's not like lean back, pray about it, let the Holy Spirit bring someone into you, and if they do, great, have that. No, like roll up your sleeves. There's work to be done. So in regards to we've had a conversation with someone. Now we need to make that step of further engagement. The part that can take courage to do. What advice can you give on how to go that extra step to do the inviting?
Yeah, I do think there's a need to be aware of the Spirit's prompting, right? I think there are times where the Spirit has prompted me to shut my mouth in a moment, right? Like I just need to let this sit with the person. They are not ready right now to respond, and I'm not going to do them any favors by pushing them into a corner to respond. I'm just going to let it sit there and see where this goes. There are times where I don't want to move any further because it feels uncomfortable to me, and the Spirit's like, hey, you need to move forward and say like, hey, what do you think about this? You want to hear more, or are you ready to make a decision? And to call people to a response in that moment. And I think even in the story, the fact that we see people respond in very different ways at the end is a reminder we're going to have people respond in very different ways. There's going to be people who mock us and sneer at us and think that we're idiots. I know we're going to talk about that in a second here. There's going to be people who are just like, hey, like, I'm intrigued. I'd like to hear a little more about this. I have more questions to ask, but it seems like this is worth spending some time exploring. And then there are people who are going to say, yep, this is what I've been waiting to hear. Like, I'm in. And you have to be able to discern kind of where people are at in that. But I do think it's incumbent upon us at times just to say, hey, so I've shared some stuff with you today. Like, what are your thoughts on this? And just open it up for them to tell you. Like, most people tell you. And if they say, yeah, this is not my thing. Yeah. Okay. I mean, if you ever want to talk more, I'd love to chat with you more. Now might not be the season. I think that the stats say that the average person has encounters with, it's either 7 or 9 Christians before they ever come to a point of faith. They have like 7 to 9 people share their faith with them.
Wow.
You may just be a part of plowing ground for a seed to be planted that will come at another time, and you're a part in that journey. And that's great.
Yeah.
That's God's using you, whether you know that you're being used or not. You trust it into his hands. But when a plant is in harvest, then we need to be ready to harvest the plant. So
that's I like that, because I think at least my brain can get caught up in the main goal, which is to introduce them to salvation. But that's not necessarily what...
It's not your job.
That's not your job.
No.
Yeah, it's not your job.
Your job is, if you go to the parable of the sower and the seed.
Yes.
What's the sower's job?
Yeah, to plant the seed.
To sow seed.
Yeah.
The planter's job is not even to figure out what the soil is.
Yeah.
Right? The soil, it lands on all different types of soil.
Yeah.
The whole parable is about you just sow seed, you sow seed, you sow seed, and ultimately God will work out the results.
Yeah, it's that picture. I don't know if you've seen that picture of the giant boulder with the tree growing up through it, and it cracks the boulder. Maybe that's too old-fashioned. I am old now, you know. No, those are great listener questions. I'm so glad we got to touch on them. You mentioned the eye rolling, Derek, and maybe you've experienced this too, Daryl. In Derek's message, he talked about the eye rolling that we face.
If he hasn't, it'll be in the next year or two, because he does have a daughter.
Said by someone who has a teenage one now. So
does it come that quickly?
It starts early, doesn't it, Blair?
Oh yeah.
Wonderful.
I think I saw my first eye roll even before they could talk. So.
I think Parker has rolled his eyes at me a couple times. It's fun. It's fun.
They come by honestly, because I also am an eye roller. So when you asked us to check our own selves, Derek, I was like, oh no. I got to check my eye rolls. I did it at Kirk once, and I immediately apologized. It was out of a bad dad joke, I think. But either way, eye rolling is not okay. So the eye rolling, and you kind of referenced it, Derek, as like when they find out you're a Christian, you know, whatever reputation they're gleaning from of what Christians are like, or whatever, there's an eye roll or whatever. So I know I've experienced the eye rolling that you mentioned, and we know Paul did. And I have to say, it genuinely stings. I react to the eye roll, and you told us, you know, you got to let it go. That's going to be a challenge for me, because it's a bit sore. And it can immediately shut me down. Like, I don't want to take it anywhere from there. But there isn't really a way around it, is there? And is there a space here for some advice? Is it still possible to build a bridge with an eye roller?
Hey, I would say on that point, I mean, though it might hit you emotionally, the eye roll, I think it's important just to own it.
Okay.
At the end of the
good
day.
Advice.
Because I think you could go the other route, is if you feel like someone's rolling their eyes, they think you're a little less cool because you go to church on Sundays and you call yourself a Christian and like all these things. Like you could try to be like, oh, you know, I only go to church, like, you know, only when I feel like it, you know, like you try to like, you know, backpedal a little bit and just try to make it seem a little bit more cool. I'm like, just own it. Because at the end of the day, I mean, they'll see through that. If you try to, you know, dress it up any way to make it cool. Just in the same way, like I just joked about, like Parker rolls his eyes at me sometimes. I'm like, well, I'm trying to actually make these awful dad jokes around him, right? I'm leaning into it, right? Because to me, it's just fun, right? It's just a fun thing to do. And so, I mean, you can just own it. You can just be like, hey, this is who I am. And even double down, just be like, no, like I truly do believe this. And I think it's absolutely foundation to who I am. And I think that is something that can be deeply respected in the world around us. Like authenticity, like actually authentically following Jesus is far more attractive than someone who is just going through the motions. And I think, unfortunately, many people have encountered Christians who don't authentically, truly believe it. They just are are Christian in name, but do they actually believe the gospel? And if you truly do, then you, at the end of the day, you can say, yeah, you know what, this might make me a little bit strange, and that's okay. I'm cool with that, because I would rather be a little bit weird and have Jesus.
I like that.
Yeah, I agree with what Daryl's saying there. The word, this was when we were in the passage, and they were calling Paul a babbler,
right?
Which was derogatory.
Yeah.
Right. They were saying this.
What's he babbling about?
This silly, ignorant fool is babbling on about nonsense. Right. Yeah. Let's get honest. I felt it. I struggle with this, so I'm with you, Blair. The real issue is my pride.
Yeah.
Right. Like that's at the root of it.
Yeah.
That somebody would think that I'm stupid because I follow Jesus, right? I must have checked my brain at the door and been brainwashed to believe all of this silliness about a man who rose from the dead. That's what makes it a struggle for us. For some of us, for others of us, I think it goes a little bit of what Daryl said, which is others of us are people pleasers.
Oh, okay.
We just want everybody to like us.
Yeah.
Right. I don't care whether everybody likes me, but what I would like them to do is respect me.
Yeah.
And feeling disrespected, feeling like somebody thinks I'm stupid, I want to show them, no, you're stupid,
right?
Right? And I get into an oppositional framework with them, and I lose, what was Paul's first point, which is a heart of love and brokenness for this person. And instead, the person becomes an opponent to me, instead of someone who I am seeking to engage out of love.
An opponent. That's a good word. I feel the saying, check yourself before you wreck yourself, comes up in my head when
you are old.
I'm like,
you know,
old. Like, but really like the eye roll and you get the sting. It's like, no, check where that sting's coming from. Yeah. Is it pride? Is it
if it's one thing if they roll their eyes and my heart is broken because they don't want to engage with the gospel and it's broken for them, but it's rarely that way I'm just being really honest. That's not usually the thing. It's me being proud and feeling like, you think I'm an idiot? You're the idiot.
Sure. But also like where you were talking about, like, I don't know if doubt's the right word, but like, you know, if you genuinely believe this and want them to, you know, and for them to know, and actually doubt is a good word because it can catapult us into this next question here, Derek. And I know, Daryl, I feel like we've talked about this before, so I know you're going to have input here, but Derek made a point to say that why, or I guess maybe I'm going to word it into a question instead. Why is believing in a God who sparks some doubt in us better than no doubt at all?
Okay.
That was a Derek quote.
Nice. Good quote.
The reason is if you have a God who is completely understandable, explainable, containable, you have a God who is only as big as your intellect, and you really don't have a God who's worthy of your worship.
Right.
If we're going to have a God who really is the God who is described in Scripture and a God who is worthy of our worship, there's going to be mystery that ends up being involved in this. He is not going to be explainable because not to the like, again, this is a tension that we live in. I think it's important that we have reasonable faith.
Yeah.
That we have thought through and wrestled through, that we, when we come to these doubts, it's okay to wrestle through them and to try and come to a conclusion, but there also has to come to a point where we can rest and say, I'm going to be okay with some level of doubt. In fact, my God's so big that it's just an outflow of who he is, that he's going to spark some inability to understand him in me, right? Again, if you can understand it all, your God's too small.
So then we're having a conversation with someone. They ask a question we don't understand the answer to. What happens now? I'm in it with them. They're interested. They ask a question and I go, come on, Daryl. What do I do?
What do you do? That's a great question.
Do I stare blasé at them?
Yeah. Well, I mean, if they ask a question that you don't have an answer to.
Yeah.
Here's what you don't do, Blair. You don't make up an answer on the spot.
Good to touch on that.
Okay, don't do that.
No.
Yeah. I mean, I'm just trying to think beyond it because I feel like the answer is obvious of like, you need to own up to it. Just be like, I don't have a good answer to that. And hopefully that's an obvious answer. I guess in my mind, it's like, you know, what Derek just said. I guess you could kind of make it up. Just
I've been guilty of that in the past, right?
Like, well,
I'm just going to kind of try to figure this out on the fly. And that's not ever a good way to go.
No.
Pull out like some like random, Thomas Aquinas quote that somehow vaguely, you know, I mean, like you just like try to like come up with like some random answer.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think, and this is why I think, again, going back to something I said previously, just like being really honest and open. Like if someone has a question, they press on you where they're like, well, that doesn't make sense. And you're like, oh, I don't know if that makes sense. A good point. Like, and then you can just kind of honestly dialogue with them about how like maybe that's a struggle for you as well.
Yeah.
And how like, I don't have a perfect answer for this situation. And again, it goes back to, are you intellectually sparring with the person?
Yeah.
Or are you journeying with them to the right answer? And I think people can spot that. Like if you're just sparring with them, and I've been in this situation quite often where someone has questions. I just got like the answer like right away.
Yeah.
Just right away. Here's the answer.
Okay.
And at the end of it, I'm like, I don't think I won that person over. I think I won the argument.
Okay.
But what did that even accomplish? There's no gold medals in that. But it's far more effective if I can actually pause and be like, hey, good point. We just had a youth Q&A night last week. And I'll absolutely love that. Just answering questions that students in our church have and just trying to really genuinely wrestle through those questions in front of the students. They could see like, I'm thinking about this as well. This isn't just some canned answers. Yeah. Just read your Bible more and follow Jesus, but actually like dig deeper into those types of questions. Yeah. And I think when talking to students or with anyone, that's going to be more helpful.
Yeah. Yeah. Cause you kind of drew a line of differentiation. Like you talked about the difference between intelligence or intellect and knowledge.
Yeah.
Why do we need to assume intelligence, but not necessarily knowledge?
Yeah, I think that sometimes we assume knowledge. Like we want people to, like if we're talking with them about something in the scriptures, that they would have like a knowledge of who Adam and Eve are, or of Joshua, or of Moses, or like these certain types of things where it's like, oh yeah, in the Bible where it says this, and they'll be like, oh no, actually I don't know that story, because I mean not everyone grew up in the church, and again I've had some conversations with some people where they're like, oh man, this generation, they don't know anything about the Bible. That's awful. And I'm like, yeah, that's true. Like they don't. So, and this is what we're talking about, meeting people where they're at. Yeah. I'm like, I cannot complain that someone doesn't know. So often when I'm talking with someone, I'll genuinely ask them, I'm like, this reminds me of Adam and Eve. Have you read that? And like genuinely, like if they haven't, that's fine. That's the assuming knowledge, but I'm assuming intelligence. I'm like, but if I summarize or if I read the first couple of chapters of Genesis, they're going to get it. Yeah. Because they're incredibly intelligent, just as intelligent or if not more intelligent than myself. And so that if we begin the conversations that way, I find that's really helpful. It goes way further than just assuming that someone knows perfectly what we're talking about. And it's a way to check our language. I shared with Derek the YouTube video I referenced on Sunday morning of this guy for 5 minutes straight is explaining this new technology that his company developed. And you watch it and you think you understand. You turn off the video. You're like, I have no idea what that machine does, what his company does. It sounds smart. Yeah. And so he's assuming knowledge that I know what electrons and like all these things are. But I'm like, if he would actually truly explain what this is, you'd actually get it a little bit more.
This is like super important especially for those of us who have grown up in the church. Yeah. We assume a lot all the time with the way that we speak to people. And it's normal. It's natural. You see this in like Amanda is a teacher, and she will get into teacher talk. Yeah. Which is usually throwing around a bunch of words that are in English, but nobody uses outside of teaching.
Got it.
And in fact, it's report card writing time. Oftentimes, Amanda will run her comments by me before she puts them. Because if you're a parent and you've had the joy of reading report card comments in today's day and age, you recognize that it's an art of putting down a bunch of words that seem to say some things but don't really say anything at all.
Right.
Right? So like, and this happens if you go into a medical field and you hang out, if you were hanging around and a bunch of nurses and doctors are talking, you're going to be like, they are talking English, but I'm not tracking with full understanding of everything that is being said.
I was just about to say, so my wife, she works in the medical field too. And sometimes she'll tell me what she's been up to. And I'll just kind of make fun of her after she's explained this whole thing. I'm like, yep.
Yeah.
And I totally understood what you just said.
I think a lot of people are like that, because Steve will even show me like pictures of plumbing. Like, oh, look, I look and I'm like, I can't think of a picture I'd like to look at less right now than a bunch of pipes.
One of the greatest compliments that I've ever received is when mom came up to me and said, my 13-year-old son loves your messages and understands what you're saying when you say it.
Awesome.
Then I'm like, man, okay, so I've hit the mark, right? Yeah. Like I've made this approachable to, if the 13-year-old boy who's in there, hopefully then the 76-year-old grandmother who's in there can understand too.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, the reality is here, like a lot of this can sound scary or daunting or unsettling. But again, back to your point, Derek, you kind of like straight up tell us that it takes work, like, and there is work that needs to be put in. And, you obviously it's not all on us, and it doesn't happen on our own. And, we have the Holy Spirit's help.
Yeah.
But
and ultimately only Jesus saves, and only the Holy Spirit opens the eyes of the blind and allows them to see and can move a dead person to life.
Exactly. And, so that takes the
pressure off of us.
For sure. When we discuss, we can forget that sometimes. Yeah. But you did give some practical books, and I wanted to touch on them because as you mentioned them, I was like, ooh, I have something to say about that. Yeah. You mentioned The Reason for God by Tim Keller, and A Case for Faith by Lee Strobel. Yeah. I have read both of those books. Yep. And as someone who I'm trying to think about a way to say this without dissing myself. I like to understand things in an understandable manner, and my reading level and my vocabulary is probably pretty average, maybe a little below. And The Reason for God was great. It was a challenge. I had to go back a bunch because I was like, I don't know what I just read. So if you're someone like me, and maybe even you're like a new Christian, I would recommend The Case for Faith.
It's more approachable.
It's absorbable, quite
He's writing it from the position and a background of an investigative journalist who is just doing interviews with really smart people.
Yes.
Asking his questions that are representative of the questions that regular people have.
And The Reason for God was unbelievable. It was so good, but it was like on an intellectual level, touching on apologetics as well. And like, it was so good still, but like I needed to have quiet while I was reading it because it was intense. So that just kind of gives people a gauge of like, what kind of reader are you? But these are great books. And I think it's really important to just kind of say that it's not meant to be comfortable. It's not meant to be anything else, but we are sent. And this is what we are called to do, and we need to roll up our sleeves for sure.
Yeah, and ultimately, listen, you're going to get questions that you may not be able to answer. Peter and John, back in Acts 4, are standing in front of really smart people, far more educated than they are. And you can almost see them being like, listen, in the end, if we get into like a battle of intellect, this is probably not going to turn out well for us. You guys are way more knowledgeable, way more schooled.
Right.
But here's what I know.
Yeah.
Jesus was dead and now he's alive.
Ooh, I love that.
And this is what we see over and over and over again in Acts. And I said this on Sunday, that Christianity, as we see it unfold in Acts, is less an explanation and more an announcement.
Yeah, it is. You said it's the same thing being said over and over and over again.
Because ultimately, that's where we have to keep on going. Was the resurrection a historical reality? Did Jesus really die or rise from the dead? And this is one of the greatest points that Keller makes in his book, that like, this is the question that you have to solve before you solve any other question.
Yeah.
Because to paraphrase Keller, if Jesus rose from the dead, then you should probably listen to everything he has to say.
Yeah.
But if he didn't rise from the dead, why do you care about anything he has to say?
Right. The ultimate question.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. Great conversation. I want to give you guys a chance to leave your listeners with whatever you like today before we wrap up. Now's your chance.
I'll conclude with the same way I ended the message on Sunday. I think in verse 16, Acts 17, verse 16, where it explains that Paul's heart was provoked within him. His spirit was provoked. His heart was grieved for the people around him. And so as we talk about this idea of meeting people where they're at and explaining the gospel, it really needs to come from a heart that has been broken and grieved for the people around us. That we're not trying to win arguments or points. We're trying to truly win souls. And if you approach the conversation, if you approach your relationships around you from that perspective, I think that's the right place to start. That's truly going to lead you into some great conversations and will force you into those conversations because of your love for the people around you. And so that'll be my encouragement for the listeners today. If you're wondering where you start, just think about those that are around you, those in your network, maybe in your own family or around you, like whatever your network is, maybe the people maybe a group chat that you're part of. We all have different networks, but is your heart grieved for those who are lost?
Yeah, that's exactly where I was going to end up there. Also, I would call our listeners to pray one of two things. If your heart is not moved towards wanting to share people, pray that God would break your heart for lost people.
Definitely.
And if you are looking, and I've just been so encouraged by so many people coming up to me and saying, man, I'm just so moved to want to share my faith with my coworker, with my neighbor. Like, I just think God is really working on the hearts of a lot of our people. And they're wondering, okay, where do I start with that? How do I engage in a conversation? And Blair, we've talked about this. I know Steve's prayed this prayer and you've shared about how it's worked in his life.
Yeah.
Just begin praying.
Yeah.
God, open the door to a conversation. Help me to listen to this person or see this person with eyes that direct me into knowing how to engage with them in a way that speaks to the questions of their heart, the things that they are wrestling with, the hurts that they're going through.
Yeah, I love that. And the thought that I'm kind of left with at the end of our conversation is just, if ever I was going to open my mouth and talk about something or even be called or sent to do something, I can't think of anything that I feel more privileged to do than just to spread the good news of the gospel and God's love. So that we can just even focusing on that. And you mentioned Steve, and let's tell more stories next podcast, because this is a practical week, and we'll probably
You can tell without me. I'm not here next week.
Okay, well, you're allowed to take a week off, I guess. But we'll tell some more stories because I find those very encouraging as well.
For sure.
And next week as well, I'm going to get Kirk or Daryl to give us a little teaser for what our next sermon series is, but we will leave that for you to anticipate. Ooh. Oh man, not yet. I mean, I love Christmas. All right. Thanks for listening, everybody. We'll see you next week. Have a good one.